What if everything you think you know about the Civil War is only half the truth? What if this wasn't just a war about freedom, but a conflict fueled by power, money, and hidden agendas? Behind the heroic stories and patriotic speeches lies a darker reality, one filled with propaganda, divided loyalties, and unimaginable suffering. This is not the version taught in classrooms. This is the untold truth of the Civil War, and once you hear it, you won't see a nation divided before the first shot. Long before the first bullet was fired, the United States was already breaking apart from within. The North and the South were not just two regions, they were two completely different worlds. In the North, factories were rising, cities were expanding, and a new industrial economy was taking shape. In the South, life revolved around vast plantations, where agriculture, especially cotton, dominated everything. This economic divide created tension that went far beyond politics. It shaped how people lived, how they thought, and what they believed their future should look like. But the real danger came from the growing mistrust between the two sides. Politicians began using fear as a tool, warning their people that the other side would destroy their way of life. Newspapers fueled this fear, spreading exaggerated stories and turning neighbors into enemies. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, it became the breaking point. Southern leaders saw his victory as a direct threat, even though his position on slavery was more complex than often portrayed. Within months, several Southern states chose to leave the Union, forming their own government, the Confederacy. But here's what history often ignores: many people in the South did not support this decision, and many in the North were not fighting to end slavery. Loyalties were divided, families were torn apart, and the nation was no longer united. When the war finally began at Fort Sumter in 1861, it was not just the start of a conflict, it was the collapse of a nation from within. The war was never just about slavery. While slavery is often presented as the central cause of the Civil War, the reality is far more complicated. Yes, slavery was a major issue, but it was deeply connected to economics, politics, and power. The Southern economy depended heavily on enslaved labor, generating massive wealth through cotton exports. At the same time, the North was rapidly industrializing and wanted policies that favored factories, trade, and economic expansion. This created a clash of interests that made compromise increasingly difficult. Many Northern leaders were not initially focused on ending slavery; their main goal was to preserve the Union at all costs. Some even stated openly that they would allow slavery to continue if it meant keeping the country together. Meanwhile, Southern leaders argued for states' rights, claiming they should have the freedom to govern themselves without interference, but this argument often hid the deeper goal of protecting slavery as an institution. Propaganda played a powerful role on both sides. People were told stories designed to provoke fear and anger, pushing them toward war. What's even more surprising is the international dimension of the conflict. European powers like Britain and France were closely watching, as their industries depended on Southern cotton. The Confederacy hoped for their support, while the Union worked hard to prevent it. This wasn't just a national conflict, it had global implications. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes: the Civil War was not driven by a single cause, but by a complex web of interests that made peace almost impossible. The shocking reality of the battlefield. When the war began, many believed it would be quick and glorious. They were wrong. What followed was one of the most brutal and deadly conflicts in history. Soldiers on both sides entered the war with little training and unrealistic expectations. But the battlefield quickly turned into a nightmare. Advances in weapon technology had made guns far more deadly, yet military tactics had not evolved to match. Soldiers were sent into direct combat, facing devastating firepower that cut them down in seconds. Battles like Gettysburg and Antietam resulted in tens of thousands of casualties in just a few days. But the horror didn't end there. Disease spread rapidly through camps, killing more soldiers than the fighting itself. Medical care was primitive, and surgeries were often performed without proper anesthesia. Amputations became common, and infection was almost always deadly. Beyond the battlefield, civilians suffered just as much. Entire towns were destroyed, families were displaced, and food became scarce. The Union's strategy of targeting Southern infrastructure meant that ordinary people were caught in the middle of the war. But perhaps the most lasting damage was psychological. Soldiers returned home changed forever, carrying trauma that no one at the time could understand. Letters from the front reveal fear, confusion, and a growing realization that the war was not what they had been told. This was not a story of glory, it was a story of survival in the face of unimaginable suffering. The turning point that changed the meaning of war. By 1863, the war had reached a critical point. It was clear that something needed to change, and when it did, it transformed the entire purpose of the conflict. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate territories were free. While it did not immediately end slavery, it changed the meaning of the war. What began as a fight to preserve the Union became a moral struggle for freedom. This decision had a powerful impact. It allowed African American men to join the Union Army, strengthening its forces and giving the fight a new sense of purpose. Thousands stepped forward, determined to fight for their freedom and their future, despite facing discrimination and unequal treatment. At the same time, this shift made it difficult for European nations to support the Confederacy, as doing so would mean supporting slavery. Another key moment came with the Battle of Gettysburg, a turning point that stopped the Confederate advance into the North. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the war, but it gave the Union new momentum. Still, victory was far from certain. The war continued with relentless intensity, and both sides paid a heavy price. Yet 1863 marked a shift, not just in strategy, but in meaning. The question was no longer just who would win, but what kind of nation would emerge from the ashes. Victory, loss, and a legacy that still divides. As the war entered its final phase, the Confederacy began to collapse under pressure. Resources were running out, morale was fading, and the Union's advantages were becoming overwhelming. General William Tecumseh Sherman's campaign through the South brought total destruction, targeting railroads, farms, and cities to break the Confederacy's will to fight. It was a brutal strategy, but it worked. By 1865, the end was near. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, bringing the war to a close. But the end of fighting did not mean the end of suffering. Just days later, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, shocking the nation and leaving it without the leader who had